Salutations, gentle viewers. I am George from Ireland, and this video is about Tucker Carlson because I had a request from one of my myriad faithful viewers. So I wish to ask this question: is Tucker Carlson the foulest person on American television? And that's saying something. It strikes me that he's a racist demagogue. Now, Alex Jones is off the air. I know Alex Jones wasn't on television as such, but it was a radio show really, but it was filmed, it was shown on YouTube, but I think he's been deplatformed. Not an assault on free speech as such, because no one is legally obliged to give him a platform. If nobody wants to broadcast his stuff, well, that's it. He's still allowed to say it on the street. He can pay for his own television channel, and perhaps Tucker Carlson will be going the same way. So Tucker Carlson is all-American. He's a flag waver, but he overlooks the motto of his country, a pluribus unum, out of many, one. So diversity. They were starting with the 13 states, and they could all have different laws. They could do things different ways. And Americans often tell me the United States was the first country to have religious freedom. So that's that. And in other ways too, not just freedom of expression. People don't have to conform, and they don't have to be white, and they don't have to be Christian, and so on. But try convincing Tucker Carlson of that. So he grew up in California, if I've got that right. Wealthy. I think it was through his father's advantageous second marriage. He's got a BA from Trinity College, if I got that right, in Connecticut. But he didn't seem to have any concern for the needs of the masses in America for a long time. The last few years, he's changed his tune somewhat and is often empathizing with the working class, although the words working class probably never passed his lips. His ancestry is British and Swiss, way back in the 19th century, but the Swiss side, the surname was Lombardi, as in Italian-speaking Swiss, like Lombardia in northern Italy. Anyway, as it's pointed out, well, your ancestors were immigrants too, which is true. But he did make a reasonable point. Yes, just because my people came to America at some point doesn't mean that I can never criticize excessive immigration or illegal immigration. Now, I realize that immigration can be splendid and it can be dreadful, and it varies. Depends who is coming in, who is an individual, not as an ethnicity, not as a nationality. That doesn't bother me in the least. Seems to trouble him very deeply. Now, I'm not an American, so immigration to the United States doesn't impact on me. I've not been to the USA for years. And say to myself, I'll go again when this whole terrorism situation calms down, when they don't start from the assumption that I'm Osama bin Laden, and it's up to me to prove to the country. But I realize it's not going to calm down. This is the new normal. Paranoia. Land of the free and the home of the brave is the land of the afraid and the home of the perpetually uptight. So he's often denouncing the ruling class. The ruling class, would that be rich, straight, white males, just like him? I mean, who else the ruling class if it's not that, if it's not multimillionaires or corporations and so on, despite worshipping Trump? Now, I can't think of a better personification of the ruling class than Trump. Now, I know Trump is the ugly face of it, but a rich, straight, white male. He was even born in New York City. It's got to be from one of the more consequential parts of the country. One of the coasts would be the ruling class. The ruling class are not situated quite so much in Wyoming or South Dakota or something, are they? And notably, Tucker's latest contribution to English literature was Ship of Fools, which was his assault on the ruling class in America. And he pictures various politicians on the front cover. Trump is not among them. And Trump is obviously the foolish person there is. Just look at his antics of last week. He declared this trade war on China, which are good and easy to win, according to himself. He's never cited a single example of when it's been good or easy to win, and I don't know anyone else who has. And it's got worse. Trump is so moronic, he actually thinks that Cathay is paying these tariffs. No, American companies are paying them, which is cutting into their profit margin, or else they're passing on to consumers, probably a combination of the two. It's an error so fundamental that it beggars belief. But of course, Carlson doesn't think that Trump is foolish. And, Trump suggesting he'll suspend the trade war. Suddenly he's going to ratchet it up. Then these early morning tweets with spelling mistakes. And in a tweet, he managed to wipe billions off the stock exchange, or the values of various shares. I mean, who would have thought that Trump's words would have an impact? I mean, he's only the president of the United States. He doesn't need to exercise any self-control. He doesn't have to have any filter between brain and mouth. But Carlson thinks that Trump is splendid. I've never heard him criticize his idol even once. Anyway, Mr. Carlson is married with children, but he doesn't bang on about family values that much, actually. I don't think anyone has claimed that he has been unfaithful to the marriage bed. It wouldn't bother me two hoots if he had. So Carlson is most notorious for being an anti-immigrant demagogue against immigrants, both legal and illegal. All right, we have the law should be upheld. Illegal immigration is not okay. Now, if I were a poverty-stricken person living in Guatemala, for instance, might I immigrate illegally to the United States? I might well do, and wouldn't feel I was a particularly bad person and say, come on, this is a victimless crime. I had a Czech friend years ago who worked one summer in Chicago washing cars, doing it illegally. He was there as a tourist. And I said, you are bad. And he said, I'm not bad. No American would do this job, which isn't quite true, but very few Americans would do this job, often a below minimum wage job with no benefits, like no health insurance to do with that. So much of Carlson's anti-immigration rhetoric has this undertone of anti-Hispanic prejudice. The problem for him is not really the numbers, but often that they come from Latin America, that Spanish is their first language. Is it their skin tone? He doesn't explicitly say so. Am I being unfair? Have I got it wrong? And doesn't like the way that Mexicans say actually tacos are our invention. My tacos. So I suppose he'll accept the melting pot in some ways. He likes the cuisine of other zones of the world, but doesn't want the people who invented them. Of course, California, where he lives, and quite a few other states, were once part of Mexico. But that doesn't mean that obviously Mexicans should be allowed in, definitely. And he said that Hispanic people moving to the United States legally, as well as illegally, becoming citizens, it makes the country poorer, more divided, dirtier. Well, I mean, it's more divided if you foment hatred against them. I don't know of any Hispanic people who foment hatred against whites. Perhaps there are some, but I think it's rather few. And there's this white victimhood complex, claiming that there's this counter-prejudice. Now, there is anti-white sentiment in the United States, but it's not very much. If you look at the statistics of hate crimes, yes, there are hate crimes against whites, but they're very few. I'd rather there were zero, but it's a far less significant problem than hate crimes against other ethnic groups. I mean, the whites obviously are the majority. There's strength in numbers, and whites, 65% of the population, non-Hispanic whites, have more than that in terms of wealth and more than that in terms of congressional representation of virtually everything. Dirtier. How on earth would Hispanic people make the United States more unhygienic? What a vile thing to say. Just trying to appeal to the basest bigotry. This man, his loathsomeness is bottomless. Poorer. Now, how would they make the United States poorer? It's possible that they could, and this is one of the anti-immigration arguments I think sometimes holds water. So immigration, it can boost the economy, it can drag on the economy, it can have a neutral effect. Depends how many people you let in, what skills you've got, are they going to fill in certain skill sets and things like that. So really, it's not the end of the world. Since 1776, the United States has absorbed tens of millions of immigrants, but as always, the next 1,000 are going to be the end of the world, according to people like Tucker Carlson. Remember the caravan about a year ago, and then that one disappeared. We never heard about that one. Remember the caravan in October, and how many of them actually crossed the border? Very, very few, I think. And mark my words, right on cue, before Trump's re-election, another caravan will suddenly appear. So by his friends, you can know him. You've got to judge him by the company he keeps. He has been warmly endorsed by the Daily Stormer, which is an openly neo-Nazi publication, and he has got a very high approval rating from Identity Evropa, which is another white supremacist hate sheet. So Mr. Carlson himself abominates leftists. So I think it's reasonable to critique left-wingers. I'm a right-winger myself. I don't think they're all detestable left-wingers. But when it comes to Trump, he's always advocating for President Trump. I'm not defending him, which is what he says, but he's always precisely defending President Trump. Anyway, it's incredible the ludicrous stuff he comes up with, that in the 1900s, the United States was close to a communist revolution, but was just about saved. I mean, the first communist revolution in the world, well, to succeed, was Russia in 1917, and the Communist Party in the USA wasn't even founded till after that, and then it was absolutely minuscule, never got as much as 1% of the vote in any presidential election. Of course, its strength was hugely inflated by the yellow gutter press, claiming it posed an existential threat to liberty. And by the way, I'm a passionate anti-communist. I could talk about that another time. But really it was a chimera, the notion that a red revolution was a significant danger in the United States. Now, Mr. Carlson, he's known for being anti-abortion. I don't think he's big on alternatives, on solutions, like publicly funded contraception. If abortion is the final horror, surely you should contemplate anything to reduce it if you can't stop it entirely. And which is worse, paying a tiny bit more in tax, or all these children getting killed? Come on, Carlson, even you are surely not quite that selfish, not be willing to sum up a few more pennies of your many millions. Or what else? Or maybe more men having vasectomies, things like that. More sex education in schools, because, unwanted pregnancies, they're always going to happen. We'd have fewer of them if we can't have none of them. He's very much against affirmative action, and I'm broadly in sympathy with that. Having seen how deep-seated and sometimes subconscious racial prejudice is, I sometimes wonder whether affirmative action is unavoidable, especially on a racial basis, not on a gender basis, because, men and women are somewhat different. Some of that's genetic. I realize that some of it is conditioned, but I don't accept the same as about races. I don't think that we can automatically assume that every race has an equal amount of talent in all areas of achievement. And obviously there's a spectrum in any racial group of everything, of IQ, of speed at short distance running, at musical ability, if that can even be quantified, and things like that. So it's not that everybody of a particular race, so say the Korean ethnicity, is equally good at maths to each other, or that everybody of the Native American ethnicity is equally good at the high jump. There'll be a spectrum within each racial group, but the average in certain racial groups may be higher or lower than others. Anyway, so there are parts of Mr. Carson's worldview that I concur with. For instance, he's against smoking bans. Well, I prefer if restaurants and bars don't allow smoking, but my way of doing it is to say, we'll have a certain number of smoking licenses, which you can pay for, and certain restaurants and bars can pay extra for it. And the staff, you don't like being around cigarette smoke, tough. Get another job. Move. It's an occupational hazard. I would bring back tobacco advertising. I would lower the smoking age to 16 and things like that. These smokers, I regard them as highly responsible citizens because they voluntarily pay extra tax, they die sooner, they draw pension for shorter. I mean, we could just smoke our way out of this pensions crisis, because smokers on average die 12 years younger than non-smokers. Let's say to the United Kingdom, life expectancy of 79, retirement age of 67. If everybody smoked, life expectancy would be 67, and the pension crisis would be solved. Now, we're not going to get back to 100% smoking. Even in 1950, when Dr. Richard Dole published his celebrated article in the British Medical Journal proving the causal link between smoking tobacco and pulmonary cancer, at that time 80% of British men smoked, women a bit lower. So even then not everyone smoked, because some people simply don't like it, other people didn't do it for puritanical reasons, or they were miserly. Anyhow, he's against compulsory seatbelts. I have some sympathy in that direction. On the other hand, then these people get brain damage when they survive, and the public has to pick up the bill for them. But Carlson will probably be against that. So, yeah, the nanny state is a bad thing. I want some more government. Yet I don't hear him rail against the big military, and that is the biggest of big government. That is the biggest big-ticket item on the budget. If the United States slimmed down its military to a reasonable level, taxes could be lowered incredibly, a lot of the deficits could be paid off, and on and on. And the military is big government in not only financial terms, but people having to be controlled completely to wear uniforms, have courts martial and things like that, and all sorts of areas where the public are not allowed to go. There's greater secrecy and things like that. So it leads to civil liberties being restricted. So I'm not against having armed forces altogether. I'm not a pacifist, but there should just be a sensible level. I think America should remember what it was actually like until the 1940s. The US Army, the US Marines were very small. The US Navy was always quite big. So actually the American way is not to be a very militarized society as it is now. One of the most militarized in the Western world. Remember the NATO target is 2% of GDP spent on the military. The United States is one of the only ones that meets that, and is actually at 6% of GDP. If the US slimmed down to the NATO average, well then it would just free up a staggering amount of money. Anyway, I digress. So Mr. Carlson, he wants less regulation, yet he said if he were president, he would prohibit self-driving trucks in a split second. Why? Well, these self-driving vehicles, they're going to put so many people out of work. His compassion towards the proletariat is touching. But he's only felt this the past few years. Is it because it's almost overwhelmingly white men who are the truck drivers? Because he doesn't care about other sectors of the economy. People are suffering, like fruit pickers, whether they're American citizens or whether they're recent immigrants, or dishwashers or squidgy men or waiters or anybody else, or those without health insurance. Couldn't care less about them. So there is a protectionist suddenly being an economic interventionist. What happened to economic freedom? So the thing is, if the United States doesn't introduce self-driving vehicles, other countries will. So they'll have a competitive advantage. They'll be able to deliver their goods faster and cheaper, and the United States will be losing out. So thing is, to diversify the economy, these people have to get other jobs in other sectors. It'd be more difficult for them. But I realize that he's onto something here, because, within 20 years, there'll probably be no truck drivers, no taxi drivers, no train drivers, no pilots, no bus drivers. Increasingly self-checkout, already have it in shops, self-check-in in hotels, self-check-in in airports. So many retail and service sector jobs are going to go. Are we going to have robots cleaning for us, even serving us in restaurants, because they're getting so sophisticated? So a lot of these blue collars are staring into the abyss. Now, Carlson, he is a hyper-aggressive interviewer, and he's on Fox News mostly, and like most stalwarts of Fox News, he's got two modes. Is either sycophancy or savagery, just being an attack dog for anyone he thinks is a liberal leftist. Notoriously, when he brought on Mike Avenatti last year, he was snarling, he was interrupting his guest all the time. What kind of a host is he? He repeatedly referred to this man as a sleazy porn lawyer. Now, as he's all in favor of freedom of expression, presumably Carlson wouldn't object to people watching pornography. And don't tell me he's never looked at porn. Come on. But his porn would probably be a speech by Trump. Anyway, but why is Trump not called a sleazy porn president? As even he doesn't deny that he hung out with Stormy Daniels. He claims not to have intercourse with her. So he paid her over $100,000. Does Trump pay $100,000 to everyone he doesn't have sex with? I can assure you, Trump's never had sex with me. May I have my $100,000, please, Donald? I'll say it didn't happen if you say it didn't happen. Why else would he possibly give her this non-disclosure agreement and wouldn't even use his own name? David Dennison was his pseudonym. So there we are. The other vile things he said, when the liberation of Iraq, which he now opposes, and said the Iraqis should obey the United States. Well, it's their country. The whole idea was the US was freeing the Iraqis to have free and fair elections, which they now have, to determine their own future. Not to just be a vassal state, but he now thinks this war has been a cataclysm. Anyway, he claimed that Mexico interfered in the United States election by sending Mexicans into the United States. Mexico didn't send anyone. People choose to go, just like Americans could choose to go and live elsewhere. That's that. And so, yes, some Mexicans lived in the United States for over 5 years, passed the English language test and all the rest of it, but they became American citizens. A bit like Carlson's ancestors came from the British Isles and Switzerland. Was that Switzerland interfering in American elections? Or was that the British Isles interfering in Americans' elections? The very suggestion would be outlandish. So anything he can to stoke hostility towards Hispanic Americans, to suggest that American citizens of Hispanic background are not real Americans, to delegitimize them, to other them, it's repulsive. and he denies the whole Russiagate thing. Well, I shan't go into that. Another issue. Now, Trump, when he was standing for the presidency, he was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, and Trump said, no, I'm not going to say a word against the Ku Klux Klan. You'll notice Trump will never speak out against the Ku Klux Klan or never speak out against a certain foreign leader. And Trump, he adores tyrants. Isn't that amazing? That's his go-to position, where he's always so scathing and contemptuous of the leaders of free countries, whether it's Canada, France, Mexico, the United Kingdom, any democratic country, any country that's an American ally, he despises. Yet he adores these autocrats who killed journalists. Anyway, so Trump would not even bring himself to speak out against the most notorious terrorist organization in the United States. That's the Ku Klux Klan. Just because they're white Christians, lynching black people. Now, I know they haven't done it for about 20 years, but they've never repudiated all those vile crimes they committed for well over a century. So Romney said that it was despicable that Trump wouldn't bring himself to denounce the Ku Klux Klan. And then Tucker criticized Mitt Romney for saying that. I mean, why won't you criticize the KKK? They're worse than Al-Qaeda in what they've done in the United States and the sheer number of people they've killed in the United States. Anyway, at the same time, Tucker Carlson is perpetuating this mythos that there is white genocide in South Africa. All right, so about 10% of the South African population are white. They're much richer on average than black people, and South Africa's got a very high murder rate. And yes, whites are killed occasionally, and sometimes the people who kill them are black. But that doesn't prove a racial motive. If a white person kills a black person in the United States, that doesn't prove it's for a racist reason. Sometimes it's for a racist reason. And so in South Africa, when whites are killed by black people, that's usually just a financially motivated crime. And the murder rate for whites is lower than for black people. But nobody's telling me that there's black genocide in South Africa. Okay, the population of South Africa, the black community, is divided into about a dozen linguistic groups. And occasionally there have been ethnic tensions between them. The ethnic animus in the early 90s boiled over into fighting. The Zulu people fighting against other black groups and so on. Or Zimbabwean immigrants, often illegal, sometimes set upon and attacked by black South Africans in 2008. But Tucker Carlson, where was he then? Didn't give a damn about any of that. He couldn't care less about black people being killed. When he was first a journalist, it was the early years, well, it was the last few years of apartheid. He never spoke out against it then. He only cares about white lives. He doesn't mind Syrians being killed in huge numbers, I suppose because they're mostly Muslims, or, Muslims in Iraq, in Afghanistan. No, couldn't care less about them. So he is perpetuating this white supremacist fallacy that there is white genocide in South Africa. Now, I've got cousins in South Africa, and none of them has ever told me that there is white genocide in South Africa. So it is anything to spread this notion that there is white victimhood and to increase hatred of black people by white supremacists. So really that's his stock and trade. That is his standard talking point. Whites were under attack. The other ethnic groups are evil. Anyway, so to land seizures in South Africa, the South African government is considering land reform, compulsory purchase of white-owned agricultural property. Now, as a policy I don't support. Obviously, until 1652, there were no whites in South Africa. Then the Dutch East India Company founded their settlement Kaapstad, that's Cape Town, as just a victualling point en route to the Dutch East Indies, i.e. Indonesia. And so the first whites arrived there. Anyway, the land had a very low population density. The whites sometimes were occupying land that nobody held before. There was a terra nullius principle. Sometimes they purchased lands. Sometimes they attacked black nations. We can call them nations. Why not? Why nations, not tribes? And sometimes sequestrated their land. So that was invasion. But anyway, here we are, 350 years later and more. And South Africa's over 80% black, and the black-dominated government is sometimes taking back this land. Fair or unfair, it's debatable. I think they shouldn't. But anyway, there's no doubt that a government is entitled to pass the law it likes. And that's that. That's an internal matter. He goes apoplectic if any foreigner dares poke his nose into the internal affairs of the United States. South Africa, a country I believe he's never been to, but he feels authorized to pontificate on South African domestic affairs. So black land was seized and now it's being taken back. Let's take the United States in his own country. The US government, which was exclusively white until the late 19th century, they appropriated Native American land. Sometimes it was purchased, sometimes it was outright invasion. Treaties were signed, quite often broken. You may have heard of the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act, and all the rest of it. And there were reservations in his country for Native Americans. Was it wrong of the US government to take land off people? He probably thinks it wasn't, but he thinks it's wrong of the South African government to do so today. Anyway, we talk about how Iraqi territory was seized. So Tucker Carlson, he really is detestable. I'll explain why he's so hateful. Well, it came to light recently by the efforts of a fabulous dirt-digging young journalist intern that from 2006 to 2008, Mr. Carlson, he gave the benefit of his wisdom to the fortunate listeners of Bubba the Love Sponge radio show. And in this, Mr. Carlson stated that it was not worthwhile invading Iraq because the country was comprised of semi-literate primitive monkeys. Now, how does he know whether they're literate or not? Obviously, they're very highly educated Iraqis abroad. I've met some of them, doctors and the like. Many of them can speak absolutely flawless English, and I don't believe Mr. Carlson can speak any other language. Iraq, which is actually the cradle of civilization, I very much doubt he knows that. Writing began in Iraq. The presumption of innocence in trials began in Iraq. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. So if you go back to ancient Mesopotamia or Babylonia, you'll find all this out. You can see that for many centuries they had splendid architecture when our ancestors in Europe were living in caves. So it was a foul racist slur. He was dehumanizing them. And yet he's always harping on about white victimhood. Oh, the dumbs, my heart bleeds, we have it so bad. He claiming that the Iraqis do not use lavatory paper or forks. Now, I mean, I don't know about the lavatorial paper habits of Iraqis. I would assume that most of them do use lavatory paper. And, okay, yes, people occasionally eat with their hands there. And I have had dinner with some Iraqis and seen them use knives and forks. But, I mean, has Carlson never eaten a hamburger or a hot dog? Has he eaten with his hands? I suspect he has. What if he's eating ice cream? Depends what you're eating, actually. But as for lavatory paper, it's true in the Middle East people sometimes use a sort of hose, like a bidet system, right? That's not wrong to do that. And some people say that's even cleaner because there's even less chance of your hand coming into contact with your cloaca. Anyway, he also lambasted lunatic Muslims who are behaving like animals. Well, obviously they're lunatics of every ethnicity, including white Americans, and Tucker Carlson should know. Behaving like animals. We're not quite sure they're behaving like animals. So here he is constantly trying to bestialize them, suggest that we don't have any sympathy for them, that they don't count as people at all, and therefore any violence that's committed against them is not wrong at all. What does he want from a president? Kill as many of them as you can, talking about Iraqis, and you'd be elected king, is what he said. Wow. An exhortation to genocide. I don't think it's entirely tongue-in-cheek, actually. So he has a soft spot for violence, for those who hate other people according to their faith, and for authoritarian rulers, for hyper-aggression, and not just verbal aggression. Kill as many as you can. Isn't that the kind of thing that ISIS or Al-Qaeda might say about infidels? So really, he really just is the mirror image of them. It's, toxic white supremacy, chauvinism at its worst, this vile sort of jingoism. Then talking about Warren Jeffs, well, this really is intriguing. One of the accusations laid at the door of Muslims quite often say, oh, look at the Prophet Muhammad, he married Aisha when she was 6 and blah, blah, blah. Warren Jeffs was the leader of the fundamentalist Church of the Latter-day Saints, and in 2008 he was sent to prison for years because he had performed these illegal marriages with underage girls, 14, well below the age of consent, and I think in Texas where he did it, and he had incited a man to copulate with her, and that was that. So that was statutory rape. So Jeffs is serving years in prison. He did this several times. And Carlson, then he said that was acceptable. said, yes, but this man loved her, so he promised to look after her, so that's okay. So it's permissible to break the law in this case. Underage intercourse is acceptable. One of the things often people accuse Muslims of is saying, oh, well, they're one they adulate, he committed an underage intercourse, which is actually very dubious. That comes from the Hadith and not from the Holy Quran. And the Hadith, well, there are 62 Hadith. Some Muslims believe in these Hadith, some Muslims believe in that Hadith, and in the Hadith there are many different statements, and some of them are considered to be true, others are more doubtful. So that one, I think, is very dubious. But anyway, but there Carlson was defending statutory rape, and yet he will try and stoke hatred against Muslims for the same thing. And this is a statutory rape which definitely happened, which led to convictions in Texas courts. And at the same time, Carlson, he indulges in anti-homophobic slurs. Why? Because those who are really homophobic, well, it's been proven quite often are closet homosexuals themselves. Nothing wrong with that. If he's secretly gay, if he wishes to keep that private, that's fine. He can be taciturn about his urges. But there's an intimate relationship between repression and perversion. And it's been proved by psychological studies. Putting sensors on the penises of these men, showing them gay pornography, seeing how aroused they get, getting them to answer a survey. How would you feel if your son told you he was gay? How would you feel if your best friend told you he was gay? And those with the most hostile responses are usually the closet gays. So when all this came to light, all his vile Islamophobic, racist ranting, his incitement to genocide and so on, he refused to say sorry. How was this man on the air? I mean, apart from when it comes to incitement to crime, and he does incite crime sometimes, I believe he does have the right to say what he wants, not just the legal right, the moral right. I would defend that, to publish his books. But, you know, a channel that's worth the name would not give him airtime. If he wants to pay for his own show, that's something different. But really, it's a disgrace to Fox News, even that network, that they should let this vile monster spew out hatred.